Have you ever caught yourself wondering whether the thoughts inside your head are truly yours, or carefully placed there by design? In a world that praises information overload, what passes for thinking is often just reacting to noise we never questioned. You were told you had freedom of thought, but never taught how to recognize when that freedom had already been sold. Because the most dangerous form of control isn't the kind that locks your body. It's the kind that programs your mind. It doesn't scream, threaten, or force. It whispers in advertising, hides in education, and dresses up obedience as maturity. They don't need to censor your words if they can shape your definitions before you even speak. They don't need to imprison you if you proudly carry the cage inside your own mind. You were never asked to think. You were taught to repeat, to believe, to conform, and to call that thinking. And every time you questioned too deeply, the system gave you a label to silence your doubt: irresponsible, rebellious, ungrateful. So you learned to suppress the questions, to shrink your wonder, to survive by thinking within their approved limits. But deep down, you can feel it, that quiet discomfort, that inner friction between what you were told and what you know. Not knowing what's true anymore isn't a failure of intelligence. It's the symptom of a mind held hostage by invisible hands. And now you're left staring at a life built on thoughts that never began with your own clarity, only someone else's agenda. So the real crisis isn't just misinformation, it's mental occupation and the silence we've mistaken for peace of mind. Because once you start to think for yourself, not everyone will like it, especially the ones who benefit when you don't. Independent thinking isn't dangerous because it's violent. It's dangerous because it can't be predicted, controlled, or easily redirected. A man who thinks for himself doesn't follow the crowd, chase approval, or swallow truth prepackaged in headlines and hashtags. He questions why things are the way they are, not to rebel, but to see what no one wants to talk about. And that kind of vision, it threatens the very foundation of every system built on unquestioned obedience. The modern world doesn't fear chaos. It fears clarity. It doesn't fear emotion. It fears awareness. Michel Foucault once wrote, "Power in the modern era doesn't repress. It organizes behavior, conditions perception, and installs invisible norms." That means you don't have to be chained to be controlled, just conditioned to think inside lines someone else drew for you. They don't ban the question. They flood you with so many answers that you forget how to even ask. They don't silence you by force. They distract you with noise, keep you busy, exhausted, and constantly performing. Schools don't teach you how to think. They teach you how to follow instructions, memorize conclusions, and pass standardized tests. Media doesn't inform. It polarizes, provokes, and floods your attention, so nothing has time to sink in. Even your conversations become programmed, repeating safe opinions, avoiding hard truths, always echoing what's already been said. And the moment you ask something deeper, the moment you break the rhythm, the moment you say, "Wait, what if that's not true?" you become the problem. They won't debate you. They'll label you. They'll dismiss you with one word: conspiracy, extremist, ungrateful, unstable. Because real thinking threatens the machine, not with fire but with clarity. A society built on manipulation cannot afford men who see, because those men don't comply, they confront. They confront assumptions. They confront systems. They confront themselves. And nothing terrifies the status quo more than a man who's willing to hold his gaze when the mask slips. So instead of empowering your mind, the system keeps it busy with outrage, trivia, dopamine loops, and endless scrolling. It's not just distraction, it's disarmament. Every shallow argument, every viral trend, every crisis that doesn't let you breathe, it chips away your clarity, because a clear mind is dangerous. A still mind is uncontrollable. A truly thinking mind is a weapon they can't own. And that's why they work so hard to make sure you never pause long enough to realize this. You're not broken. You've just never been allowed to think beyond the cage. But now that you've seen the bars, you don't need permission to step out. You didn't wake up one day and lose your mind. It was slowly taken piece by piece and you barely noticed. Every time you scrolled without thinking, you weren't being informed. You were being conditioned to forget how to question. Your brain was never attacked directly. It was distracted, overstimulated, and trained to avoid the discomfort of deep reflection. You were told the internet gave you power, but the more you clicked, the more predictable and programmable you became. They never needed to censor you. They just needed to keep you endlessly engaged until silence became unbearable. You're not lost because you lack intelligence. You're lost because your mental space has been turned into digital real estate. Each headline you read comes preloaded with emotional suggestion, telling you what to feel before you even finish the sentence. You think you're choosing your opinions, but you're just picking from a menu the system wrote while you were distracted. Fromm warned us decades ago, modern man is not forced to obey. He chooses submission to feel safe in the crowd. You didn't give up your freedom because someone demanded it. You traded it for comfort, security, and social belonging. That's the trap. You think you're free because you get to pick, but every option was designed to lead nowhere new. You're not being educated online. You're being emotionally hijacked, triggered into reaction loops that leave no space for clarity. The more outraged you become, the more distracted you are, and the more predictable you become to those who profit from chaos. You've been trained to confuse stimulation with awareness, but noise isn't knowledge, and reaction isn't wisdom. This is how they took your mind, not with violence but with volume, until you couldn't hear your own thoughts anymore. When was the last time you had a belief that didn't come from a trending opinion, a viral post, or a trusted voice? Your thoughts are not yours until you've sat with them in silence, without input, without headlines, without external validation. You were not born for this mental slavery. You were born to discern, to reflect, and to reclaim the voice inside you. And now that you've seen the loop, the headlines, the hashtags, the outrage carousel, you finally have a choice. Because reclaiming your mind doesn't begin with rebellion. It begins with silence, observation, and the courage to unplug. If you want to know whether your thoughts are your own, pay attention to how uncomfortable you get in total silence. You reach for your phone not because you're bored, but because being alone with your mind feels unfamiliar and unsafe. You crave someone else's opinion before you even form your own, as if truth doesn't exist until it's been confirmed. You don't seek knowledge, you seek validation, not what is real, but what do others already agree with that I can repeat? That's not thinking, that's mental dependency, the subtle addiction to being told what matters and how you should feel about it. When every belief you hold must be echoed by a crowd, it's not your belief, it's just your fear of isolation. You avoid being first to speak, not because you're shy, but because you need someone else to signal what's acceptable. You measure credibility not by depth or truth, but by likes, status, followers, and whether they fit your chosen narrative. You hear something unfamiliar and immediately ask, "Who said it?" Instead of, "Is it true regardless of who said it?" Your thoughts are shaped by applause. You don't trust your own perception unless someone more popular confirms it's okay to trust it. You believe in official truths, not because you've examined them, but because they come from a source you've been trained to trust. From news anchors to influencers, you absorb their tone, mimic their outrage, and carry it like it's wisdom you earned yourself. You call this awareness, but it's just compliance disguised as intelligence, and you've been rewarded for it your entire life. Real thought doesn't come with a crowd. It comes in the quiet, when you dare to disagree with the world and still hold your center. The moment you start feeling uneasy without external confirmation, your autonomy is already compromised by invisible authority. You feel discomfort when someone challenges you, not because they're wrong, but because you haven't practiced thinking without a script. You trust ideas only after they've been approved, filtered, packaged, and most dangerously, stripped of all disruptive power. When you assess people, you don't ask what they know. You ask if they belong to your ideological tribe. You judge their beliefs by whether they're trendy, not whether they're true, useful, or grounded in actual lived experience. So you've traded curiosity for consensus. You don't question to understand. You question to stay inside the social frame you think defines safety. You fear being misunderstood more than you fear being mentally enslaved. And that's exactly how the system keeps you tame. But a man who thinks for himself doesn't wait to be understood. He waits until the noise dies down, and then he sees. Thinking for yourself doesn't begin with defiance. It begins with silence, the kind that strips away everything you didn't choose. Before you reclaim your thoughts, you must first notice how many of them were never yours to begin with. You turn down the volume. You stop reacting. You listen carefully, not to others, but to the quiet voice that's been buried underneath repetition. Most people avoid silence not because it's empty, but because it's honest. And honesty can be terrifying without distraction. You were conditioned to consume more ideas, faster, louder, but you were never taught to examine the frame those ideas came in. Erich Fromm said, "Freedom is the ability to think for yourself, not just against authority, but beyond internalized control." Michel Foucault added, "The real prison is not the walls, it's the systems of thought that keep you from seeing them." They weren't warning us about dictators, they were warning us about invisible structures, the ones that shape identity before awareness begins. Independent thinking is not rebellion for the sake of ego. It's the recovery of a mind that no longer needs an audience. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to be angry. You just have to stop performing ideas that no longer reflect your inner truth. The system can tolerate critics, but it cannot tolerate clarity because clarity doesn't comply and doesn't ask for applause. This isn't about becoming special. It's about becoming authentic in a world where almost everything has been pre-approved, pre-framed, and pre-sold. You don't need to wear black, quote Nietzsche, or burn your past. You just need to stop outsourcing your selfhood. When you think clearly, you threaten the roles others still depend on, and that's why they might resist your stillness. People will accuse you of changing, being cold, distant, withdrawn, but really, you're just no longer echoing their script. That's not rebellion, that's healing. It's what happens when a man no longer trades his peace for permission or his insight for popularity. You stop needing to prove anything. You stop reacting to everything. You start choosing your thoughts like you choose your words, with precision. You won't always be understood. You won't always be liked. But what you gain is worth more than comfort. You gain your mind back. Because real freedom isn't found in having louder opinions. It's found in seeing through the ones that were silently installed. Let others chase identity through ideology. You're building yours on awareness, and that doesn't require consensus to feel valid. So no, thinking independently isn't rebellion. It's recovery from noise, from narrative, and from the performance you were taught to mistake for self. You don't reclaim your mind by adding more thoughts. You reclaim it by removing the noise you've mistaken for thinking. Start by unsubscribing from the endless stream of stimulation disguised as information, purpose, or personal growth. Turn off the voices that keep you scrolling, comparing, reacting. Voices that train your attention to abandon you constantly. If your first instinct every morning is to check your phone, then you've already outsourced your awareness before sunrise. Reclaiming your mind means removing your consent from the systems that harvest your focus in exchange for anxiety. Social media is not neutral. It is engineered to keep your brain hungry for novelty, conflict, and approval in equal measure. You scroll not because you're curious, but because you're chemically conditioned to feel empty without constant noise. Reclaiming your mind starts with silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of mental pollution disguised as relevance. Let your nervous system breathe. Let your thoughts rise without interruption. Let your inner voice speak before algorithms fill the space for you. Then start asking dangerous questions, the kind that make your inherited beliefs uncomfortable under direct light. Ask, who gave me this belief? Whose interest does it serve? What part of me is afraid to let it go? Truth doesn't always survive questioning, but real clarity does. What crumbles when challenged wasn't yours. It was installed. You don't need to argue with the world. You need to investigate the architecture of your own mental framework. Most of what you defend, you never chose. You simply repeated what felt safe to believe in public. To rebuild your mind, don't seek gurus or answers. Seek tools, maps, and thinkers who guide you inward, not outward. Philosophy is not an escape. It's an excavation. You read it not to win debates, but to recognize what you've been living unconsciously. Fromm, Jung, Foucault, Kierkegaard, they didn't offer comfort, they offered confrontation. And confrontation is how real men remember who they are. You don't reclaim your mind by becoming clever. You reclaim it by becoming aware of how deeply you've been shaped. You don't need a new opinion. You need a new relationship with uncertainty. One where discomfort no longer means danger. You reclaim your mind one choice at a time. One ignored headline, one unanswered notification, one thought you don't rush to post. Let others perform clarity for likes. You're here to experience it quietly until it becomes your new default. And when your peace begins to return, not performative peace, but grounded stillness, you'll know you're no longer being rented. This is how it begins. Not by speaking louder, but by thinking slower, not to win, but to finally be free. True freedom isn't about choosing between options. It's about realizing what shaped the options you thought were yours. You weren't born with blind beliefs. You inherited them, absorbed them, and wore them like skin until you forgot they were there. The system told you freedom was having endless choices, but never asked whether those choices came from your actual values. A man doesn't become free by shouting louder. He becomes free by sitting still long enough to know why he ever shouted. Most noise isn't resistance. It's just reaction, automated, predictable, and harvested for profit by systems that fear your inner quiet. Because once you stop reacting, you start noticing. And once you start noticing, you start choosing. Not from fear, but from clarity. That's the moment the program begins to break. Not through rebellion, but through observation, no longer filtered by conditioning. Freedom isn't the ability to do anything. It's the awareness of what's really driving you when you do it. You don't reclaim your life by escaping the system. You reclaim it by refusing to abandon yourself inside it. And sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is nothing. No defense, no explanation, just presence. Because when you no longer chase noise, you start hearing signal. The part of you that was never programmed. That's what the system fears. A man who watches without reacting, who questions without apologizing, who sees without flinching. That kind of sight isn't loud. It's final. And once you see clearly, you can never go back to sleep. So ask yourself honestly before this video ends, whose mind have you been living with all this time? And now that you've seen through it, what are you finally ready to reclaim?